Santa Monica became more expensive while housing disappeared. This is not how markets are supposed to work. When something becomes scarce, prices rise, but only if people still want it. When housing becomes scarce, prices should theoretically signal builders to create more. Supply meets demand, the system corrects itself. But in Santa Monica, prices rose while the number of places people could actually live in declined. Not over a single year, not because of a sudden crisis. Slowly, across a decade, housing availability decreased while the cost of what remained climbed higher. The city became more expensive by offering less. This should feel impossible. It happened anyway. The contradiction sits at the center of everything that followed. A place became less inhabitable and more expensive simultaneously. Residents who had lived there for decades found themselves unable to afford staying. Newcomers arrived to find almost nothing available. Property values climbed while vacancy rates fluctuated in ways that suggested housing was being used for something other than housing. The mechanisms that usually govern supply and demand seemed to operate in reverse. Scarcity did not prompt construction. High prices did not attract new housing development. Instead, the existing housing stock shrank, and what remained grew more costly. The pattern defied the basic logic that expensive places build more to capture profit. Santa Monica did the opposite. It became expensive by building less and removing what it already had. This was not a story of growth pricing people out. It was a story of contraction doing the same thing. Santa Monica sits on a narrow strip of California coast, pressed between the Pacific Ocean and the city of Los Angeles. It measures roughly 8 square miles. The ocean forms a hard western boundary. The city limits form fixed edges on 3 other sides. There is no empty land waiting to be developed. There are no suburbs to expand into. The street grid was drawn a century ago. The blocks are small and mostly full. This is not a place that grows outward. It can only change what already exists. Geography dictates the terms. You cannot build past the waterline. You cannot annex neighboring land that belongs to Los Angeles. Expansion means height or density, and both face limits. For decades, Santa Monica was dense in the way coastal California cities become dense. Low apartment buildings, small houses divided into units, rent-controlled complexes built in the mid-20th century. People lived in close proximity because the geography demanded it. The beach attracted people. The location near Los Angeles made it convenient for work. The physical limits made expansion impossible. Santa Monica was always going to be expensive, but it was also full of housing. Apartment buildings lined the streets a few blocks from the beach. Dingbat apartments from the 60s and 70s housed multiple families in plain stucco structures. Older homes had been divided into duplexes and triplexes. Rent control covered many of these buildings, keeping long-term tenants in place for years or decades. The city felt residential because it was. People walked to the same grocery stores, sent their children to the same schools, recognized neighbors on the street. This density was not accidental. It was a response to limited land. When you cannot sprawl, you fit people into the space you have. Santa Monica did this for most of the 20th century. Then it stopped. Housing began disappearing without fanfare. Buildings were not demolished in large numbers. Instead, they were converted. A rent-controlled apartment complex became condominiums. A duplex became a single-family home. A multi-unit building was renovated and returned to the market with fewer units. Each transaction was legal. Each followed the proper channels. Zoning rules restricted what could replace older buildings. Historical preservation designated certain structures untouchable, even if they contained housing that could have been expanded. Short-term rental platforms allowed property owners to remove units from the long-term housing market entirely. A 2-bedroom apartment that once housed a family for years could now be rented by the night to visitors. The city imposed regulations, but slowly, and enforcement was inconsistent. Some buildings simply sat empty between ownership changes. Others were held as investments occupied only part-time. The housing did not vanish in a single wave. It eroded. Each year, a few dozen units left the rental market. Each year, a few buildings converted to uses that did not involve people living in them full-time. No one structure mattered. The accumulation did. The process was incremental enough that it never triggered alarm. A building here, a conversion there. Each one seemed like an isolated case. Owners had reasons. The market was changing. Property rights allowed certain uses, but the pattern viewed over years was clear. The total number of housing units available for long-term occupancy declined, not because Santa Monica was shrinking in population so dramatically that it needed less housing, but because the housing that existed was being repurposed, held vacant, or removed from the residential market entirely. Some units were combined into larger luxury apartments. Some were taken off the rental market and used as short-term vacation properties. Some sat empty as investment vehicles, their value derived not from rental income but from appreciation. The city conducted studies. Reports documented the loss. Public meetings addressed the issue. But the mechanisms that removed housing from the market continued to operate faster than any policy response could counteract them. Long-term renters noticed first. Leases were not renewed. Buildings sold to new owners who had different plans. People who had lived in the same apartment for years received notices. Sometimes the building was being renovated. Sometimes it was being converted. Sometimes no reason was given. They looked for new apartments and found fewer options than the year before. Rents had increased, but availability had decreased faster. The people who left were not replaced by families. They were replaced by shorter stays, temporary visitors, occasional use. Service workers who staffed the restaurants and hotels along the beach began commuting from farther away. Teachers and city employees found themselves priced out of the city they worked in. This was not framed as displacement. It was framed as the market working. People who could no longer afford Santa Monica simply lived somewhere else. The city did not feel emptier. It still had people on the streets, in the restaurants, on the beach, but fewer of them slept there. The effect was not immediately visible. Santa Monica did not develop blocks of abandoned buildings. The streets did not look different to a casual visitor. But the composition of who lived there shifted. People who had worked service jobs in the city and lived there for decades moved to neighboring communities. The commute lengthened. The connection to place weakened. Families who had raised children in rent-controlled apartments found those apartments converted or sold. The children, now adults, could not afford to live in the city where they grew up. This was not unique to Santa Monica, but the pace and scale were notable. A city of roughly 90,000 people does not have room to lose thousands of housing units without consequences. The consequences were distributed unevenly. Property owners benefited from rising values. Long-term renters faced impossible choices. New arrivals with significant resources could still find housing, though at premium prices. But the middle collapsed. The people who made a city function daily, who taught in schools, worked in shops, staffed public services, increasingly lived elsewhere. Prices continued rising. Median home prices climbed each year. Rents increased for the units that remained on the long-term market. This made no immediate sense. Supply had decreased. Demand had not surged. The population of Santa Monica did not grow significantly during this period, yet prices behaved as though supply had remained constant while demand exploded. Explanations were offered afterward. Buyers were purchasing property as investments, not homes. Wealth from elsewhere was flowing into coastal California real estate. International buyers, tech money, generational wealth transfers all contributed, but at street level the pattern was simple. Less housing existed. What remained cost more. People who studied housing markets pointed this out. Local news covered the decline in rental units. City council meetings addressed the issue. Nothing reversed the trend. The housing that disappeared did not return. The prices that rose did not fall. The disconnect between supply and price suggested something had changed about how housing functioned in the city. It was no longer purely a place to live. It had become an asset class, a store of value, a hedge against inflation. People bought property in Santa Monica not because they intended to live there full-time, but because they expected it to appreciate. The housing itself became secondary to the investment. This created a market where prices could rise independent of local demand. Someone in another country could purchase a condominium and leave it vacant most of the year. Someone with multiple properties could hold one in Santa Monica as part of a portfolio. The unit still existed physically. It still counted in housing statistics, but it did not house anyone. The price reflected its value as an asset, not its utility as shelter. This pattern was not unique to Santa Monica, but the city's geographic constraints amplified the effect. With no room to build outward and restrictions on building upward, every unit that left the residential market created scarcity that could not be easily replaced. And scarcity in an investment-driven market meant higher prices. The people who needed housing to live in competed with people who wanted housing as an investment. The latter had more resources. The former lost. What replaced housing was not other housing. It was presence without permanence. Short-term rentals filled with weekend visitors. Investment properties sat vacant between uses. Second homes were occupied intermittently. The same buildings that once held families now held travelers, part-time residents, temporary stays. Retail spaces that once served daily needs shifted toward tourists. Restaurants changed menus to attract visitors rather than locals. The infrastructure remained residential, but the use had changed. This was not abandonment. Buildings were maintained, often upgraded. Money still flowed through the city, but it flowed differently. A place that once functioned as a neighborhood increasingly functioned as a destination. The distinction is subtle but measurable. Neighborhoods have schools that stay full, grocery stores that serve daily shopping, people who recognize each other. Destinations have hotels, vacation rentals, restaurants with lines. Santa Monica still had people. It had fewer residents. The shift changed how the city operated. Businesses catered to visitors who had more to spend in shorter periods. Long-term service businesses struggled. The clientele that returned weekly for years was replaced by clientele that came once and never returned. This was more profitable in the short term but less stable over time. The city's tax base shifted. Revenue from hotel taxes and sales taxes increased. Revenue tied to residential property taxes grew due to rising values, but the population that paid those taxes was smaller and wealthier. Public services faced pressure. Schools saw enrollment decline as families left. The city invested in amenities that attracted tourists, beach improvements, public art events, while services for residents received less focus. This was not a conspiracy. It was a response to economic incentives. The city earned more from visitors than from residents. Policy followed revenue. The people who lived in Santa Monica full-time found themselves in a city increasingly designed for people who did not. Parking became harder to find because visitors drove more. Public spaces filled with tourists. The rhythm of daily life changed to accommodate a population that was always arriving and leaving. Long-term residents adapted or left. Many left. Santa Monica exists now as a city with less housing than it had before and higher prices than it has ever seen. The coastline has not changed. The street grid remains the same. The buildings still stand. But the number of places where people can live long-term has decreased while the cost of accessing those places has increased. This was not an accident. It was the result of choices about land use, regulation, investment, and priority. Other coastal cities have followed similar patterns. Other places where geography limits expansion have seen housing availability decline while prices climbed. The mechanism is replicable. A city does not need to grow to become unaffordable. It only needs to stop housing people. Santa Monica still draws crowds. The beach still fills on weekends. The palm trees still line the streets, but fewer people sleep there than before, and those who do pay more for the privilege. The city functions, but differently. It remains desirable, but less inhabited. The people who work there increasingly live elsewhere. The people who live there increasingly do not work. The ones who both live and work there are fewer each year. This is the outcome of housing prices rising while housing disappeared. Not a collapse, but a transformation. A place became more valuable by becoming less useful to the people who needed it most. The buildings stand. The views remain. The location has not moved, but the city has changed in ways that cannot be easily reversed. Housing once removed from the residential market rarely returns. Units converted to condominiums do not revert to rentals. Buildings used for short-term stays do not go back to housing families. Investment properties held for appreciation do not suddenly become affordable. The forces that removed housing continue to operate. The city has implemented policies to slow the loss, but not reverse it. Santa Monica today is more expensive and less populous than it was a decade ago. The housing that disappeared is gone. What remains is a city that still looks like a place to live, but functions increasingly as a place to visit.